Chairman. A warm welcome to our stakeholders events with Joyce Watson, MS, focusing on the impact of gender-based violence on children and young people. Welcome also to our speakers, Kate, a Welsh member of the Girl Guiding Advocate panel, Jane Hutt, MS, Minister of Social Change, Vivian Lang, Policy and Public Affairs Manager, NSPCC Wales Cymru, and Lara Snowden, Public Health Wales Lead at Violence Prevention Units. Croeso chi gyd. Before we start, I would like to remind you to remain muted unless you are invited to ask a question or to make a comment. To respect everyone's privacy, please could I ask you not to take any photos during the event. Please switch off your cameras if you do not wish to be visible to other participants. I would also like to make you aware that we will be recording this event. The Stakeholders event forms part of the Not in My Name campaign set up in 2012 in partnership with Joyce Watson, Minister on the Senate. Not in My Name involves WI members across Wales getting involved in recruiting male ambassadors from their communities to speak out against violence against women. Over the years, campaigns have gathered the support of many choirs, male choirs and sports clubs across Wales, the Cardiff Devils ice hockey team, the Wales Rugby Union, Glamorgan Cricket, and Olympian Christian Malcolm, and others. Violence against women is an endemic across the world. Tragic events such as the murder of Sabine Mesa and Sarah Everett have highlighted that much more needs to be done to end violence against women. There is much to do to achieve a culture change where violence against women is not tolerated by society and where women and girls are able to live their lives free from fear and violence, harassment and abuse. As has been highlighted over the recent month, it should not be women and girls that are expected to make efforts to keep safe. It is the perpetrators that need to be held accountable for their actions. Men and boys must be part of the solution in ending violence against women. Men and boys need to be engaged in changing behaviours, in challenging the inequalities and attitude that contributes to violence against women. The focus on today's stakeholders event is on children and young people. At our stakeholders events last year, which focused on violence against women in rural community, a recurring theme that arose was the need to ensure that children and young people across Wales affected by domestic abuse were able to access the specialist support that they needed. The Welsh Women's Aid have reported that there have been an increase in the number of children in refuges. Children and young people have been reporting on their traumatic experiences of sexual harassment and abuse at schools, colleges and universities via the Everyone's Invited website. All schools and other educational establishments are expected to be a safe place for learners. The Violence Against Women, Domestic Abuse, Sexual Violence Wales Act has been in place since 2015. Is this making a difference in improving the lives of children and young people by addressing some of the area that I have just referred to? The Welsh Government will shortly be launching its new strategy to support the implication of the Act. What do we need to see this strategy to support children and young people? I will now hand you over to Joyce for her opening comments. Diolch, Joyce.
Thank you, Arian. As we gather here to discuss the impact of violence, I want to take a moment and to remember the public service of Sir David Amess, a thoroughly decent man who lost his life in the service to his constituents. I'm deeply saddened by this senseless act, and I'm sure everybody here would share that thought with his family and his friends today to let them know we're thinking of them. Returning to today's meeting, thank you for all of you who are taking part in what is a hugely important and timely meeting. I'm here to listen. I'm looking forward to hearing from our excellent speakers, and I want to hear your thoughts and questions for a really productive discussion later, so don't be shy. I hope that we all learn together and make positive changes for children, young people and their families who will need our support. This year, as you know, we're focusing on the impact of gender-based violence on children and young people. Sadly, there is still crucial work to do. Many situations have been worsened by lockdown and the tensions of the difficult time, with whole families behind closed doors together. Too many children have seen and experienced things that they shouldn't. As the NSPCC say, domestic abuse always has an impact on children, directly or indirectly. It can impact children's development, educational outcomes, and their mental health. Being exposed to domestic abuse in childhood is child abuse. We need to ensure that they can access the specialist support that they need. This is the start of this year's Not in My Name and White Ribbon campaign. Now more than ever, we need men to step up and to speak out on this, and Arian has already said that. We all know abuse starts in small ways, but the extreme example is Sarah Everard's killer, who displayed abhorrent behaviour long before her murder. In his case, people did try to challenge his behaviour, but there's a separate discussion to be had on how he was able to continue down that path. Of course, that act was not isolated, and at least 112 women have been killed by men so far this year in the UK. 17 years ago, we held the first white ribbon candlelit service at Llandaff Cathedral. Then, once I was elected to the Senedd in 2007, we continued that work. The following year, we recruited our first Welsh White Ambassador International, Dedwyn Jones. As Arian said, I teamed up with a wonderful WI 9 years ago, and their members have recruited hundreds, possibly thousands of ambassadors across Wales. Male ambassadors are playing a huge role in challenging attitudes, and I hope we can recruit even more to come forward to help tackle violence against women and girls after today. Most of you here have also applied your energy, your expertise and dedication to tackle these issues, and I thank all of you for that. So without further ado, I'll hand you back to Arian.
Diolch, Joyce, thank you. We'll now hear from our four speakers, and after we've heard from the four, there will be an opportunity for you to ask questions or to make comments. So it's first, the warm welcome to our first speaker, Kate, who is representing the Girl Guiding UK. Kate has been a member of the Welsh member of the Girl Guiding Advocates panel for the last 3 years. Advocates work with Girl Guiding on their influencing and advocacy work to make sure that the voices of young women are heard. Croeso, Kate.
Diolch. Bore da and good morning. My name is Kate Roberts. I'm 21 years old and I'm a member of the Girl Guiding Advocate panel, and I have been for the last 3 years. Girl Guiding is the UK's leading charity for girls and young women, with nearly 1/3 members. Through the 4 sections of Rainbows, Brownies, Guides and Rangers, Girl Guiding gives girls and young women a space where they can be themselves, have fun and adventures, build friendships and gain valuable life skills to make a positive difference to their lives and communities. As advocates, we work with Girl Guiding on their campaigns and research to make sure that the voices of girls and young women are included when discussing issues that affect them the most, issues such as sexual harassment. Following the public conversations this year about women's safety after the murder of Sarah Everard and the reports of widespread sexual harassment in schools on the Everyone's Invited website, Girl Guiding published It Happens All the Time. Their findings of a survey conducted with more than 400 young women aged 13 to 18 about their experiences of sexual harassment. Girls are on the receiving end of harassment all the time, from unwanted attention and comments to physical harassment and abuse. Our research shows harassment is widespread in all parts of the country, in all areas of girls' lives, including in schools, public places, and online. Findings from the survey show that feeling safe when outside is a major issue for many girls and young women. This increases amongst girls surveyed who are people of colour or identify as lesbian, gay, bisexual, queer, or questioning. 80% of all girls surveyed said they don't feel safe when they go out alone, which is a worryingly high number of girls and young women who feel unsafe in public due to a fear of being harassed. The findings showed that young women from the age of 13 are already aware of sexual harassment and are taking extra steps they feel are necessary to keep themselves safe. This includes not going out on their own after dark, taking a less convenient route because it is safer, and letting people know where they are or where they go at all times. Women are often thinking of their safety whenever they go outside, and many of these considerations become a part of their everyday lives. It also suggests that the burden falls on the individual and what they need to do to keep themselves safe. Public sexual harassment and its effects are detrimental to girls' well-being, and it negatively affects their freedom and opportunity. Girl Guiding believes more needs to be done to address the safety concerns girls and young women have, and that these should be taken into account. We also support Plan UK's calls to make public sexual harassment a criminal offence. As the girls surveyed are aged 13 to 18, Girl Guiding asked them specifically about sexual harassment they had experienced at school to get a better understanding of the issue in this setting. 67% of the girls said they had experienced sexual harassment at school from another student. When asked about a variety of experiences in a school setting, 43% of 13 to 16-year-olds had received unwanted comments, which increased by 20% amongst girls aged 17 to 18. And 23% of 17 to 18-year-olds had experienced unwanted touching, such as having their bra strap or skirt pulled. It is also concerning that there is a large increase in this figure as girls get older, and also amongst girls of colour or who identify as LGBTQ. By the time most girls leave school, they've already experienced some form of sexual harassment. Schools need to take a zero-tolerance approach to sexual harassment and prioritise effectively implementing sex and relationships education. Whilst the young women surveyed were concerned about their personal safety, and many had experienced some form of sexual harassment, the findings of this report suggest boys are not as aware of this issue or do not have as much understanding. 53% of all the girls surveyed feel that boys don't understand what isn't appropriate behaviour towards girls. This is why Girl Guiding feels that education is key to tackling these issues and changing behaviours by making sure young people are taught about respecting others, gender equality and sexual consent. As well as receiving harassment in public and in schools, many girls also experience sexual harassment online too. In Girl Guiding's latest Girls' Attitude survey, 71% of girls surveyed between the ages of 7 and 21 had experienced some form of online harm in the past. This included sexist comments, harassment, unwanted sexual images, and bullying. Girl Guiding is asking that the UK's government's online safety bill includes consequences for online platforms that fail to tackle online harassment to protect girls and young women when they are online. The culture of harassment needs to be tackled in all areas of girls' and young women's lives in order to allow them to live their lives to the fullest. Thank you for listening.
Diolch, Kate. And it's over to Joyce.
Thank you, Kate. that will form part of the debate, I'm certain. It's my role now, and I'm delighted to welcome our next speaker, Jane Hutt, Minister for Social Justice. It would take far too long to list all of Jane's achievements and experience both as a minister and before that, but she was the first national coordinator of Welsh Women's Aid. She founded the South Glamorgan Women's Workshop and was director of Chwarae Teg Gender Equality Charity. She's been a good friend to this campaign, supporting every event since we started. So over to you, Jane.
Diolch yn fawr, Joyce, and bore da, diolch yn fawr am waharddyd I heddiw. Thank you very much for your invitation today, and particularly important for me to be here alongside Joyce Watson, who has been an absolute champion. And it's not in my name that as a result of Joyce's partnership with the National Federation of Women's Institutes is why we are working again together, a stakeholder event as we did last year, particularly looking at violence against women in rural areas, that we are together with this powerful agenda today. So it is a great honour for me to be speaking alongside Joyce, but also good to see Jack Sargent here as well, joining us as one of our key white ribbon ambassadors who spoke up when I made a statement only a couple of weeks ago as a result of a question from Joyce after the horrific killing of Sabina Nessa, and acknowledging again what it is that the Welsh Government, our responsibilities should be in terms of women and girls' safety. And not in my name, we didn't realise that here again, so many years after I was involved in setting up the first Women's Aid Refuge, that we are facing this scourge of violence against women and girls. And as we head towards White Ribbon Day, we're reminded of the vitally important message that this period holds, but it should not be just as we approach the day. It is an opportunity, although it's day in, day out in terms of our responsibilities and our actions, it is an opportunity, White Ribbon Day, to recommit ourselves to spread the message in public life, public and political life, and in government. So I think Kate, the advocate for girl guiding, has been so strong and clear, and thank you, Kate, for coming and speaking so powerfully today. Violence against girls is, and of course women and girls, is still ever increasingly far too common. And the results of your survey, Kate, showing harassment, abuse and violence, daily occurrences for girls as well as women. And in recent times, we have heard the effects of violence against women and girls. Today we will, and we do, remember Sarah Everard and Sabina Nessa. These cases have sent shockwaves through us all, but I'm very conscious of every year Jess Phillips, the MP in Westminster, reading out the names of lost women's lives. And this is why this attention must then produce action, and particularly for those with power and responsibility. I think it's also the fact is that Not in My Name has played that part year in, year out, and of course the power of the movement of women's institutes across Wales and the UK, sparking a renewed call for change across our society, because violence against women, girls, domestic abuse and sexual violence is a societal problem, and it requires a societal response. As we know, violence and abuse not only affects the victims, but also their children, families, and all of those around them, as well as having a negative impact on society as a whole. And we must challenge attitudes and change behaviours of those who behave abusively. And it's not for women and girls to modify their behaviour, it is for abusers to change theirs. A point that both Joyce and Jack Sargent have made so powerfully in our Senate, not just in recent weeks, but over the period of their service and their representation in the Welsh Parliament. I think this is the fact that we have to get that change of behaviour, that societal approach is the only way to end the pattern of violence, stamping out this behaviour, not for our current generation, but for our children and their children too. And of course, as I said, having a huge impact violence against women on children and young people, affecting their well-being, their educational attainment, family and peer relationships, and their ability to enjoy healthy, happy, respectful relationships now in the future. We have to say this has been compounded by the COVID-19 pandemic. Over the last 18 months, we've seen increasing numbers of children and young people who've experienced and been witness to violence and abuse at home, with less access to support from adults and support service, specialist support services. And in that same thread, we've seen a drop in the number of children supported in the community as lockdown restrictions present barriers to support. Access to school, of course, was so important for victims, women and girls in that situation. And we know that this will leave lifelong scars for those, and it is those have been affected. It's simply not acceptable. But we've been very clear as the Welsh Government about our ambition to end violence against women and girls. The Violence Against Women, Domestic Abuse and Sexual Violence Act from 2015 and the national strategy which resulted from that, launched in 2016, has pushed this agenda in many areas of government and other public bodies, supporting our drive to prevent gender-based violence and protect and support victims and survivors. And one of our 6 key objectives within the national strategy is to increase awareness in children and young people of the importance of safe, equal and healthy relationships, and that abusive behaviour is always wrong. And the first phase of the strategy, the last 5 years, is coming to an end. And the Welsh Government is now working on the next 5 years, and we'll shortly be consulting, widening the parameters of the strategy for the next 5 years, pushing this agenda further than ever before. So our new strategy will include a focus on violence against women in the street and workplace, as well as the home, when we are to show that we're serious and we say we want Wales to be the safest place in Europe to be a woman. Alongside this, we need to ask ourselves how that we can change the culture on the ground for our young people. As Kate has explained so clearly, and everyone's invited, and that's a huge survey of schools revealing harassment of girls and young women in schools. One thing is clear, that we can only achieve our goals with a cross-sector commitment. Raising children and young people's awareness of equality, respect and consent is crucial if we're to stop violence against women, domestic abuse and sexual violence. We want to ensure all children and young people have access to high quality learning, responding to their needs and experience. Relationships and sexuality education, as has been said, will be made a statutory part of the new curriculum for all our young people. And we recognise that not all children and young people are educated within a school or similar environment. So we're going to consider how best to support learning in other settings. But this doesn't stop with school-age children. VADA SV Guidance for Higher Education, published in March of this year, revised in November, last year, and revised in November to account for the impact of the COVID pandemic. But we have wider campaigns and activities. And I want to thank all those who've adapted through the COVID-19 pandemic to continue delivering services which support us in this movement. They're moving resources online to continue to deliver training and provide support. And we've now provided around 250,000 people with training through our national training framework since this was launched. You will all know our Live Fear Free campaigns, which continue to raise awareness of stalking, harassment, abuse, and violence against women and girls in all aspects of life, including the street and other public places. And I remember last year in Cabinet, when we were discussing restrictions and how we were responding to the coronavirus and lockdown measures, how important it was when we said there should be someone could go, two people could go running, for example, out taking exercise, and what a response we got when there were so many, and particularly those who said that they were afraid to go out on their own for exercise or for sporting activities and as well. We've got to learn from people, from women and girls, and it's so great to learn from Kate to get today about how we can provide practical advice and also continue to work with those specialist services to raise awareness of the inequality and safety issues faced by women and girls. So that's why I'm responsible for crime and justice as well as equality, working with our Welsh police forces, police and crime commissioners, public safety boards and the Crown Prosecution Service to focus on instilling confidence in victims to report incidents of abuse and violence when they occur and hold those who abuse to account. So finally from me, and I thank you again for inviting me, Ariane, particularly for opening up and sharing this important event with Joyce. It's a collective effort that we need. I'm so pleased to be here today to be part of this year's launch of Not In My Name. We cannot, as women and men, tackle Wales Vpu alone. We have to tackle it in society, we have to tackle it through government. And it's not for just women to take ownership of these challenges. That's why we do need men to never commit, condone, or remain silent about violence against women. Will we see a change this November in the White Ribbon campaign? Will we see more men being prepared to come forward as ambassadors? By empowering men to challenge these behaviours at their earlier stages, and that will be so important with our new curriculum in our schools from 3 years old upwards. We can and must stamp out the harmful and wide-ranging impacts of Wales Vpu. So finally, thank you, diolch yn fawr. Thank you, and can I give my gratitude to the National Federation of Women's Institutes Wales for continuing to run this incredibly important campaign with Joyce Watson here in Wales for another year. I hope you will be joining the annual Bowser Light a Candle event on 25th of November, which again, Joyce was instrumental, as she said, in initiating at Llandaff Cathedral. We won't be in the cathedral, but we will all be virtual. And together we can make Wales the safest place in Europe to be a young woman, and Wales will not be bystander to abuse. Diolch yn fawr.
Diolch yn fawr, Jane. We now hear from Vivian Lang, Policy and Public Affairs Manager at NSPCC Cymru. A warm welcome to you, Vivian. Croeso.
Thank you very much. I'm going to share my screen because I've got a few PowerPoint slides. So let me just, oh, hang on, which way around have I got to do it? Oh, you can't see it yet, can you?
Not yet.
No, I think I've got to share first and then, right, let me just, oh, I'm sorry about this. I should have got myself all ready, shouldn't I? Share screen, this one, share, and then if I start it. I'm hoping now you can see my screen.
Yes, we can.
Brilliant. Okay then. So thank you very much for inviting me to speak, and thank you very much for focusing on the issue of child victims for this year's Not In My Name campaign. My presentation is going to focus just on one aspect of Wales Vpu, on parental domestic abuse on children. I'm going to start with a case study of a young man who lives in South Wales, talk about the impacts on child victims, where we're at in Wales in terms of supporting child victims, and what needs to happen this Senedd term. Before we look at the case study, I want to make a few comments about the experiences and prevalence of parental domestic abuse. Children, as has already been said, are not just passive witnesses of parental domestic abuse. They're right in the middle of it. They're experiencing it alongside their non-abusing parent. And children, along with the non-abusing parent, are controlled, threatened, and live in fear. And that is why children living with parental domestic abuse have been recognised as victims in both our VP Act and in the England and Wales Domestic Abuse Act. In terms of prevalence now, NSPCC research has found that 1 in 5 children have been exposed to domestic abuse. The Public Health Wales ACE research found that 16% of adults in Wales grew up in a house with domestic abuse. As we have over 600,000 children in Wales, even if we use that lower 16%, that is over 100,000 child victims, an eye-wateringly high number of children and young people with these frightening, controlling, violent home experiences. And NSPCC research estimates that 1/3 of children living in homes with parental domestic abuse also experience another form of abuse. And we know that in Wales, 27% of children are in receipt of care and support because of parental domestic abuse, and that was over 4,000 children and young people in 2020. Now, shortly I'm going to put up a case study, but I'd like to warn you it's very upsetting. I'll not read this out, so I'll leave it to you to read in your own time. So here's the first slide. So this is a very harrowing case study, and it's very clear living with parental domestic abuse has a huge impact on your life. And this includes mental health problems. It includes acute feelings of betrayal, powerlessness, guilt. It includes experiences of flashbacks or intrusive thoughts, nightmares, poorer school performance and achievement, and also poorer outcomes economically as an adult. Increased likelihood of negative coping mechanisms. And these impacts can last long into adulthood and affect the intimate relationships you have as an adult. Fortunately, in Rory's case, he and his mum received support from the NSPCC, and there's lots of specialist services providing this support across Wales. And Rory has recovered, and he's moulded himself into the exact opposite of his perpetrator. Sadly, unlike Rory and his mum, not all women and children survive domestic abuse. The femicide census found that on average, a woman is killed by a man in the UK every 3 days, but only a few of these tragic killings make the news headlines. Most commonly, women were killed at home by their husband, partner, or ex-partner. In a number of cases, the perpetrators also killed the victim's children or killed their mother in front of the children. In 1/3 of cases, it was known that the woman killed had a child or children under the age of 18 at the time, though in almost 1/5 of cases, it was unknown whether the victim had children. Moving on to another harrowing report, Women's Aid Federation England's report, 19 child homicides. It also details harrowing findings of children murdered by their father or father figure because of unsafe child contact arrangements. And as it states in the opening lines of this report, This report should not need to be written. That much is disturbingly obvious. First, while it's impossible to prevent every killing of a child, when the risks are known, no other consideration should be more important. So, support for child victims in Wales. I'm moving on from the stats now to look at the support that is available for child victims in Wales. Obviously, we have the groundbreaking Wales Act, passed in 2015, which aims to harness agencies' collective efforts to improve the prevention of Wales Vpu and improve protection and support for victims. The key provisions in the Act to achieve these improvements are the Welsh ministers must publish and implement a national strategy, and we know that the next national strategy is soon to be published for consultation. And local authorities and local health boards must also publish and implement a local Wales Vpu strategy. Also in Wales, Welsh Government have adopted the UNCRC, the United Nations Convention on the Rights of the Child, and under Article 19, child victims should be protected, and under Article 39, child victims should be supported to recover from violence. So you would think that victims, be they adults or children, will receive the protection and support they need in Wales, but sadly, that is not the case. In the first round of strategies produced by Welsh Government nationally and regional partners locally 5 years ago, no child victims were even consulted about their needs. And many of the local strategies did not even mention or acknowledge the needs of child victims, let alone plan to provide services for them. So it was no surprise when Welsh Women's Aid published their Children Matter report in 2019 that they estimated 18,500 children and young people experienced domestic abuse in the home in the past year in Wales. And they found that 4,263 children and young people were known to access some form of specialist Wales Vpu support in Wales. However, they concluded that over 14,000 children and young people received no specialist support, and that is 77%, a huge number dealing with the trauma and impacts alone. And someone has already mentioned lockdown, and we all know that the pandemic has exacerbated problems of violence in the home. And during the lockdowns, both Childline and the NSPCC Adult Helpline saw an increase in the number of people worried about domestic abuse and its impact on children and young people. In the first lockdown, March to May 2020, the number of people contacting the NSPCC Adult Helpline about domestic abuse rose from an average of around 140 contacts prior to lockdown to an average of around 185 contacts a week during lockdown. In the same period, March to May 2020, Childline delivered over 500 counselling sessions to children and young people worried about domestic abuse. And this is an increase from an average of around 50 a week at the beginning of the year to an average of around 65 a week during the lockdown. We can therefore conclude that there are even more women and child victims who need support and services. So the action needed this Senedd term. Welsh Government's national strategy is crucial, and this year's, published later this year, must make clear that children are victims in their own right. The objectives in this national strategy published later this year are always used as a framework by the local bodies for their local strategies. So we are asking that the objective about support services must make clear, it must say, provide victims, both adults and children, with equal access to these support services. The objective in the last strategy did not include children in this wording of Objective 6, and that contributed to the voices and needs of child victims going unrecognised. Also, funding, secure and sustainable funding must be put in place for specialist services in Wales. As has already been mentioned, there's been a huge public outcry following the horrific murders of Sarah Everard and Sabina Nessa. The report by Her Majesty's Inspectorate of Constabulary into the police response against violence against women and girls concluded and recommends that there's a radical shift in the way crimes against women and girls are prioritised, and that stopping violence against women should be considered as much of a priority for the police as combating terrorism. So, at a national and local level in Wales, we need the regional partnership boards and local service boards need assessments to include as a key priority violence against women. We also want to see victims, both adults and children, being consulted when these strategies are being developed and services are being planned. It is also vital that the shortfall in service provision for children and young people victims must be addressed across Wales. Thank you for listening. Thank you for your time, and I'll be happy to answer questions later.
Diolch, Vivian. Thank you very much. And our final contributor is Lara Snowden, Public Health Wales lead at the Wales Violence Prevention Unit. Croeso, Lara.
Thank you. Okay, I'm just trying to share my screen. Can you see my slides okay?
Yes, we can.
Brilliant, thank you. Okay, thank you so much for having me here today, and thank you particularly to the last speaker. That was really, really moving. And I think our presentations complement each other quite nicely. I'm going to focus a bit more on children and young people's experience of gender-based violence in their own relationships. So it's a different angle on a really, really challenging issue. So my name is Lara Snowden. I'm the Violence Prevention Programme Lead at Public Health Wales. I also work in the Wales Violence Prevention Unit. Sorry, let me just figure out the technology. Here we go. So the Wales Vpu is a partnership of passionate people from an alliance of organisations working together to prevent violence across Wales. And we do so through a public health approach to violence prevention, which I'll talk a bit more about later in my presentation. We have a range of organisations involved in the VPU. We have a core team who are working full-time on violence prevention, including myself and other colleagues from Public Health Wales, the police, prisons and probation, and a range of other associate partners, including Welsh Government, the local authorities, Welsh Local Government Association, and we also have a range of other voluntary sector partners involved in the VPU and some commissioned services as well. We do a range of work on gender-based violence prevention with that focus on a public health, preventative and evidence-based approach. These are just a few examples of some recent work, including a systematic evidence assessment via SV, some work around domestic abuse and experience of bystanders to domestic abuse during the pandemic. And this campaign, #SafeToSay, the bystander campaign to prevent sexual violence in the nighttime economy. So that's just a kind of flavour of some of the pieces of work we've been doing. So today I've been asked to talk about gender-based violence and children and young people. So I'll talk a little bit about the kind of statistics that we've been picking up on, particularly this year and throughout the pandemic. I'll touch on the kind of impact, the health impacts in particular of gender-based violence. I'll then talk about a public health approach and what that looks like, what works to prevent gender-based violence, and some of the challenges that I foresee for the new Welsh Government and Senedd. So this is a graph I've lifted directly from the Office of National Statistics, British Crime Survey for England and Wales, and I think it's something that some colleagues may find quite shocking. But it essentially points out that for all of the people who participated in the Crime Survey for England and Wales, 16 to 19-year-old girls and young women are the most likely to have experienced domestic violence and abuse in the past year. So essentially age is a really, really significant impact, risk factor for the experience of domestic abuse. And I think that's not commonly recognised, that this is something that really does happen in young people's relationships. This is, of course, just 16 to 19, but I think we need to also consider that this does happen in children and young people's relationships below 16 as well. So that's something I'm kind of calling for throughout this presentation, to consider that age group as they cross over kind of into adulthood. We've seen, as the last speaker said, a really significant amount of violence and abuse during the pandemic, and we've been working to monitor the trends that we've been seeing in Wales throughout the pandemic. Quite early on in the COVID-19 pandemic, the UN introduced the term the shadow pandemic, and that's the pandemic of violence and abuse in the home that is perhaps less visible than the infectious disease pandemic of COVID-19 itself. But we've seen really significant increases, particularly in helpline demand for a range of different violence types. That could be violence and abuse online. As the previous speaker had said, it could be children and young people being victims of parental domestic abuse, or it could be young people kind of reaching out for domestic abuse in their own relationships. There's also been a really significant increase, I think it's fair to say, across voluntary sector agencies who have web chat facilities. And again, I think this has been increasingly used by people to kind of access those services when they're required. We also monitor administrative data. So what I mean by that is police, health and ambulance service data. So they're kind of quite key indicators of violent trends in society. And one of the things we've picked up on in the last few months has been a really disturbing increase in young people, so under 18 and 18 to 24, turning up at accident and emergency departments in South Wales for domestic abuse related assault. So that's in their own relationships. So where it was their partner who was the assailant, or where the abuse took place in the home. And this is a really disturbing trend that we've seen, particularly as the last lockdown has lifted and children and young people have gone back to schools and kind of mixing more with their own peer groups. We've also seen, again, in the spring and summer terms of 2021, data from multiple sources, including the police schools programme and from the police itself, indicating increases in violence among children and young people. And again, in the kind of spring and summer terms of 21, seeing a really significant, in fact, almost a doubling of increases in assault attendances at accident and emergency departments, where the reporting location was a school or a school bus. I'll skip over that slide, but that's essentially the data in another slide. As most of the speakers, I think, have also touched on this morning, is the really disturbing trend around sexual violence and harassment and in schools and in public places. Again, a pretty well-known survey, I think, was conducted, I think last year by UN Women UK, who found that 86%, so most of our young women, have experienced sexual harassment in a public place. There's also been the review of sexual harassment and abuse in schools and colleges in England in Ofsted in June 2021, finding really concerning levels of sexual harassment and abuse in schools. The 91 Welsh schools that were named on the Everyone's Invited website, and the announcement by Estyn to do a review into sexual harassment in Welsh schools. So I think that's really welcome. So what's the impact of gender-based violence? And again, I'm really cantering through these slides this morning because I've only got 10 minutes, but it's fair to say that this is now really well documented in the scientific literature. There's obviously short and long-term health consequences. So these can stretch across somebody's life course and indeed intergenerationally as well. And I think that speaks really strongly to the last case study. The consequences are kind of cover physical, reproductive, sexual and psychological consequences, including trauma and PTSD, and of course, fatal outcomes, which we've seen all too frequently in recent months through homicide and suicide. There's obviously also the burden on health, social care and the criminal justice system, but also society more broadly, and limiting people's ability to kind of participate fully in society and reach their potential. So I'm going to touch a bit now on kind of why is violence a public health issue? And I hope kind of present perhaps a bit of light at the end of the tunnel in how we can look to take a societal approach to the prevention of gender-based violence, and also talk a bit more about what works. So as I've just said in the last slide, violence has a really significant impact on health. And I'm a huge champion. I've kind of dedicated the last few years of my career to promoting the use of the understanding of violence as a public health issue. It certainly for me has its place among all of the other health issues that public health will typically look at. It's both a cause and a consequence of inequality. So the phrase that's often used is gender-based violence will be a cause and a consequence of inequality. But as we all know, and as other kind of speakers have alluded to this morning, this is intersected by other issues such as socioeconomic status, by race and ethnicity, and by kind of social class and things. So we have to understand all of those interrelated inequalities, and age, of course, as I talked about in the first slide. Violence is also predictable and preventable, and some of the tools and the approaches that we use in public health can be used to complement the kind of existing criminal justice and specialist service responses. So we're not saying that a public health approach should be used to replace what's done at the moment, but simply to complement. And I think we can kind of bring some of these skills to the table. So what is a public health approach to the prevention of RSV? So as I said, it's a systematic approach. It takes a whole society perspective. And critically, it's about co-producing this approach in a multi-agency fashion with partners, with communities, and with victims, survivors. It's preventative and focused on the kind of root causes of RSV. It's data-led and evidence-based, and it uses the kind of epidemiological data, as I've discussed at the start of this presentation, and the scientific knowledge of what works. But critically, that has to be complemented by that kind of local specialist knowledge and the voices of survivors and communities as well. Typically, public health approaches will also be empowering and asset-based rather than punitive. So we were commissioned last year to conduct a systematic evidence assessment of what works to prevent bad RSV by the Welsh Government to inform the new strategy refresh. So this has just been published. Please have a look on the Wales Violence Prevention Unit website. It's a pretty kind of accessible report, and it sets out how we can think about that whole system approach to the prevention of RSV and what is the evidence base. So what are the interventions that work to prevent violence against women and girls, domestic abuse and sexual violence. So the high level findings, again, really just cantering through. It's a very complex and extensive project. So we sought to review all of the academic literature that's been published over the last 7 years to prevent vowed RSV. And it provides, I think, Wales as a whole with a really strong position to inform the vowed RSV strategy refresh. Overall, the prevention of vowed RSV is increasingly feasible and effective. And for me, that's really exciting. There's now like a really strong wealth of evidence on the prevention of vowed RSV. And new evidence of effective practice is emerging all the time. But critically, and it took kind of distilling the main message from this really, really big piece of work, is that standalone interventions simply won't work. And I think lots of the other speakers have talked about this morning. We have to take this whole society approach. So what we've proposed is this development of an ecosystem of interventions that seek to prevent bad RSV through a whole system approach. So some of the programs that we've kind of recommended that have a very strong evidence base are listed here, and obviously the report is also available online. But I think the quite exciting thing, which is relevant to this conversation, is that the strongest area of evidence is really around children and young people, and working with that kind of adolescent age group to build skills around healthy relationships, transform those kind of perhaps more traditional views about gender norms and harmful gender norms, and work with children and young people to transform those and support them. So some of the examples are around working to transform harmful gender norms. Examples are kind of real consent, coaching boys into men in colleges, schools, sports clubs, online and in universities. Programs in schools, again, as the first speaker said, to prevent bad RSV, including adolescent dating violence. But these use a combination of methods, including healthy relationships knowledge and skill development, bystander training, but it has to be part of that peer-led whole school approach. We also identified a number of areas of evidence that need further work, but are looking really promising. Again, I'm just kind of cantering through these, but a number of examples would be kind of theatre interventions and empowerment approaches, social norms marketing campaigns, for example. So we're really promoting the kind of piloting of these in Wales, but really strongly evaluating them so we can understand their impact. And finally, there's some areas of the research that need further investment. So gaps in the current evidence base, for example, are what works in the workplace, the implementation of programs with diverse communities and what these can look like in different settings, programs to prevent exploitation and trafficking, bad RSV amongst older age groups, and so-called honour-based abuse. So there's quite a detailed bit in the report around those areas of research that need kind of more investment. So just in brief, again, what are my kind of challenges for the new Welsh Government and Senate? Firstly, I think, and perhaps most importantly, that commitment and investment in prevention. And critically, this has to be ring-fenced, I think, and focused on kind of evidence-based practice, but also building in the voices of survivors, communities, and specialist services as well, so that we can create some programmes that work in and for Wales and Welsh communities. As I mentioned at the start, this recognition of bad RSV in children and young people's own relationships and the systemic levels of gender-based violence. So going back to that UN Women UK survey, like most young women have experienced sexual harassment and abuse, and that's simply not good enough. And the development of an ecosystem of violence prevention, which challenges gender-based violence across our society. And we all have a role to play in preventing gender-based violence. And also building back from COVID and recognising the trauma that children and young people many children and young people have experienced during this time in terms of violence in the home, and using a trauma-informed approach and developing a society that is more resilient to gender-based violence. So those are my kind of takeaways, and thanks so much for kind of having me along today. I think it's a fantastic opportunity to have this discussion with a range of partners. So thank you for having me.
Thank you. I think it's over to Joyce.
Right, yes, it is over to me. I was still trying to write and sort out my screen. But anyway, I've managed both those things. Well, we've had really good speakers here today. We've got significant amounts of information that I'm sure we're all still digesting, but I thank all those speakers for that information. Now, you all have an opportunity to direct questions to them. Comment, if you wish, on what you've heard, or possibly, if you want, share your own experience. If you'd like to ask a question or comment, please use the chat function, and we will try to cover as many of those as we can. So it's over to you to ask questions.
Any questions?
Dave Healy.
Thank you very much, Chair, and thank you to the speakers. I think what we've heard so far is very enlightening, although of course disturbing. I am the Chair of Education in Flintshire, and so I've certainly picked up on the various comments that have been made about gender-based violence in schools, which is obviously a concern, and this is the sort of area where we really need to strive to address things and nip things in the bud, because as was said by one of the speakers, the relationships that develop in school, well, what happens there impacts on people in later life. And I've certainly picked up on the comment that Jane Hutt made about the new curriculum and the way in which that might have an impact and influence people. But also Lara drew attention to the 91 schools that have been mentioned in the Everyone's Invited website. One of the specific concerns that parents are raising with me is that there is a tendency now in schools for new building developments to include mixed toilet facilities. And I'm wondering if their reaction is old-fashioned because we need to move with the times, or whether, in fact, this provides an opportunity, an unwelcome opportunity for an increase in gender-based violence within schools. And I'm just wondering what people feel about this, or what advice they could give to me about how I respond to parents over their perhaps traditional minded view of the need for single-sex schools, toilets in schools, or whether in fact they have actually got a point.
Okay, thanks for that, Chris. I'm going to take a few questions in order of people who requested, so that we can get through as many as we can, and then appropriate people will respond. So the next person to ask a question will be Jack Sargent, and he'll be followed by Rachel Williams.
Well, diolch yn fawr, Joyce, for the opportunity to firstly be here and to ask a question. It's great to see colleagues from right across Council Healy, one of my own constituents, and Rachel and Joe from Unite and others who we know. It's very sad, isn't it, that we have to still do these events, but it's remarkably important. I think that's the first comments I want to make, so I do thank you all for that. Lara, just the question directed at you, really, if I may, and the comments I picked up from the last part of your, I think it was the very last part of your presentation, was the building back from COVID of a trauma-informed approach. Now that was very welcome to hear that, and I think it's quite a difficult read to say trauma-informed approach to many people. But do you agree with me that that's essentially just kindness in public policy, and it could be worded in that way, and trying to get that across? And on that basis then, because I do agree, I think we do need to build back with a trauma-informed approach in many things we do. How important is the ACE support hub within Public Health Wales, and is that funded appropriately, or should we seek more funding around the ACE support hub, or what advice would you give us for that? Because I think it's something that we're not often talking about at the moment. We used to 5 years ago. We've slowed down talking about ACEs, and I think we need to get back to a way where we do that, and perhaps that's members of the Senedd as well as others. No, thanks, Joyce. Thanks.
And over to Rachel.
Oh, is it over to me, did you say, Joyce, or is Lara gonna? Yeah. Thanks, Joyce. Thanks so much for putting this on again every year. And as Jack said, you know, we're sad that we're here again, and things seem to have got worse. And it's just slightly an observation. Initially, there was 45 of us on this call, and less than a quarter were men. And I think that's quite telling. You know, I want to thank Jack for his continued support, for picking up the baton where, you know, Carl sadly left it. I don't know the other men on the call, but I want to thank you very much for coming on this call, because we do need men to help us in this arena, because we can't do it alone. We've been fighting it ourselves for years. But it's just an observation. I think, you know, next year it would be nice to see it evenly balanced, at least half and half. I think we need more men on this call to be hearing it as we know it and live it and breathe it every day. But yeah, thanks again, Joyce, for putting this on.
Right, first of all, I'm not going to take all the thanks for putting it on, because mine was easy. I put my name to it, and the WI did all the hard work. So in terms of those three questions, Dave Healy talked about mixed toilets. Does that create an issue? Have we got any evidence? And building back from COVID, being kind of, and Rachel Williams, yes, I hear your call for more women, men. That's really what this is all about. But I suppose the invitees were people who held particular positions, and maybe that's something, you know, that has to be looked at. So who wants to answer, if anybody, Dave Healy's question on mixed toilets, and then Jack Sargent's, which I think was directed anyway. Anybody on the mixed toilets?
Well, I will say, I think it's an awful idea. I think they should be separate. We should have separate spaces. I deal with a lot of women in the domestic abuse arena. I had over 700 women sign up to my Freedom programme since last June. And quite often this comes up about safe spaces for women. And I think, you know, for it to be introduced in schools, I think it's awful. I think we should have single sex spaces, end of. I don't know what anybody else feels. I can see a couple of nodding heads, but I think that's certainly my opinion, and that of a lot of women that I work with.
Anybody else?
Can I come in on that? I'm a governor at a secondary school in Barry, and we've recently had a new build which is for all unisex toilets, and it's working well. We haven't had any complaints. Some of the initial concerns were dealt with by giving a tour of the school. They're very open spaces, and they're monitored. There haven't been any issues, but there are safe spaces for pastoral support to be given, which is a different matter. And maybe that's the way of taking a view on it.
Okay. Right, I'm going to take the next speaker question from Kathy Riddick, and then Jane Penton May, and Joe Galaska. I should know your name, Joe. I always just call you Joe, from Unite the Union, and I'm sorry about that. I know that names are really important, but you will remind me again how to pronounce your surname. So if I can take Kathy, Jane and Joe next, please, in that order.
Thank you. Thanks, Joyce. I had a question for Senedd members. Katie opened by giving us a really valuable insight with the survey from Girl Guides, and she talked about how education is key, and Jane followed that up talking about the statutory nature of RSE on the curriculum. That doesn't come into place until next year, and a lot of secondary schools are deferring that now until 2023, and the rollout of that new curriculum won't be completed for all children until 2026. That's a long time to wait for a new RSE code, which is replacing a code from 2010. Now, the new code is good. It's had a lot of advice from the right people on it, and it's very inclusive of the right messages. But we're still going to be working for until 2026 for some children on a code from 2010 that doesn't even contain the word consent. So if we're serious about making sure that we deal with education and getting those right messages across to children, why are we not pushing for this new RSE code to be brought in as soon as it's published, rather than waiting for the rollout of the entire curriculum? And on top of that, we've got children in year 7 and 8 now who've missed a large part of their year 5 and 6 education. And whilst the pressure is on schools to try and build back their education for them, it's on core subjects, and RSE is not being picked up. By putting some more pressure on this RSE code being implemented straight away, we could try and pick up on some of that missed education as well.
Thank you. I did find your voice really quiet. I don't know if other people found that, but I hope whoever you were directing question to did catch what you were saying. I was having difficulty. Anyway, we'll move on.
I think I'm next to speak. I'm Jane Penton May from the Wales Assembly of Women, and I did put my question in the chat box, but there was a report, I think in the Guardian, it may have been followed up in some other papers, about the fact that the number of reported abuses had increased, but the number of people that had been charged had reduced. And we know that even when there are quite a lot of people charged, the number of people who actually end up going to court for abuse is minuscule. This is across the board. This is not necessarily just against children. I think possibly the charge rate against child abusers is higher, but and we know a lot of this is hidden, so we're only seeing the tip of the iceberg. Should we be encouraging the police, and I know it's difficult to get all the evidence, etc., and get the witnesses, to be taking these things more seriously and following up more charges?
Okay. And over to Joe.
Hi, are you okay? I just want to echo what Rachel said, that yes, we need to see more men on this call, and I think we need more unions as well, because we're doing amazing work in this area, but I think, yeah, we need to be united. And just a comment about some of the stuff I've seen Cardiff University women students expressing. It's really, really concerning, the rise in incidents and feeling unsafe in the streets and stuff. So I think getting the NUS involved and the universities in this event next year, but throughout the year, is going to be important. So I will put a call out to the other unions as well, just to get more support for this.
Okay, well, that's a really good point. Yes, Unite the union do very much support the White Ribbon campaign, and of course trade unions, have a link into the workplace. So there was a lot of talk about including workplaces. So it's vital, isn't it, that anyone who has an input into a workplace is involved in those discussions. Does anyone want to comment any further on any of those questions that were asked?
Joyce, can I come in on Jack Sargent's question? Sorry, from the first round of questions. It was just to say that yes, I completely agree, Jack, that I think taking a trauma-informed approach is really critical. And just to say really that in Public Health Wales, the ACE Hub has a really kind of central place, and that they've led a lot of work around kind of that development of kindness and compassion in public policy. So taking that kind of population level lens, but also I think there's a role for more specific kind of trauma informed services to support victims and to support kind of particularly as children and young people come back to school as well. So I just kind of wanted to reiterate that I think that the work of the ACE Hub is really, really important. And for example, the report we've just published about prevention of VAD or SV, the ACE Hub are taking on a lot of the kind of findings from that, because obviously violence in the home is an ACE. So we're kind of working very closely with the ACE Hub on that.
I'm going to use the chair's prerogative now and ask the question. I'm going to Kate. And I'm going to ask Kate, you've obviously, I commend you on all the work that's been done, first of all. I commend you on being here as a young person speaking on this platform today and doing it so very, very well. But this whole conference, albeit online, is aimed at young people and getting young people engaged. And I've tried various ways over many years and have not been as successful. And I recognise I'm probably old enough, well, definitely old enough to be a grandmother because I got grandchildren at that age, so they don't communicate with me. So if we, going forward, want to engage as many young people as possible, and Girl Guiding have certainly taken that space, what other ways do you think would be good for us to take on board and learn from your successful engagement, because it's next generations that are really important to us?
Yeah, I think it's about working with organisations like Girl Guiding, where there's a lot, there's part of the reason I think that is successful is that on the sort of the level of the local units, there's a lot of trust that girls have with their leaders. They feel very safe in that environment, and that they know that if they report something that they're concerned about, even if it hasn't happened in the unit, leaders will listen to them and believe them and try to help them. And I think that for some young people, especially as I'm not sure who mentioned about the reports of Cardiff University, it's for people, say students who have moved, they don't always know where to go. They don't have somewhere, an organisation or people to go to that they feel they can trust. And I think it's about the way to engage with them is also making them know that you can that they can trust you and they can get help. And
Thank you very much. And we'll take that on board and build that in, because the one thing that struck me about girl guiding is, and it was mentioned by the minister, reaching out to young people, not always in school, because not everybody has education through school. So yeah, that's really useful, and I thank you again. And I hope you didn't mind me putting you somewhat on the spot. Are there any further questions? Oh yeah, Shahina Taj.
Good morning, everyone. For those who don't know me, I'm Shaheen Taj. I'm from the Henna Foundation, but I also work at Women Connect First. I just wanted to raise something here, which is over recent weeks, I've had several cases, in particular one that came to me about a week ago, where the police are actually encouraging victims to, rather than report it and take things further, to apply a restorative justice approach. And I have to tell you, I'm absolutely fuming in the one instance, because the victim is a 16-year-old girl who was sexually assaulted in a classroom. I won't go into the details of the case other than that, because it's a live case, and it's been absolutely horrendous. So whether a girl is 16 or whether a woman is 35 or 55, this is what's coming to me from clients. So in terms of the point that was raised about the numbers are going up in terms of reporting, but we're not getting the results in terms of outcomes of a successful prosecution, there's a little bit of a clue for you. So there's loads of things that need to be done when you're managing cases. And I've done plenty over nearly 30 years. So whether I look at things from a perspective as a victim, because I've been there, done it, worn the t-shirt, I've been campaigning against forced marriage and arms-based violence since 2005, but I've spent a lot of time in recent years pursuing cases where we get landmark changes. And one of the ones I was involved in was consent and rape, which is going back to 2013. So for me, it's really worrying that while we can congratulate each other in terms of what we achieved, but on the ground, when you can see that the trauma that people face, particularly young people, I mean, I don't know, is there any trauma therapy for children and young people? I don't know of any, but there's certainly nothing that suits ethnic minority kids. So if somebody knows of anything, I'd really appreciate it. And I'd just like to thank Lara. Your presentation was brilliant. What you're suggesting is absolutely spot on. And one of the successes that we've done in terms of honour-based violence, and whether it's in the criminal field or in the family field, the assessment that I've been using, which I developed myself, has always come from a perspective of looking at it from a perspective of the person who's been in the position, who suffered it. So, a person-centered approach or a trauma-informed approach, they kind of go in together. And the sooner that's actually done wholesale, and it's including all communities, including ethnic minorities, because what I also, find it disturbing is that, you know, there is work that that we do with men. Not enough is anything. It doesn't. I hardly ever see an ethnic minority man featuring anywhere. And I can tell you that there's a serious issue that people don't want to talk about, but I need to mention it here. So thank you, everybody. But yes, all good. But can we, you know, perhaps take an inclusive approach so all people are included?
Thank you. And you're absolutely right about minority ethnic BAME males not being on the call. If you can help us with that to widen that, if anybody on this call can do that, that'd be absolutely fantastic. I don't know if there's anybody here from the police who want to say anything. I'm going to put people on the spot now regarding your question, or anybody else, because I've heard stories, I'm afraid, like that. This is not the first. Nobody? Okay, we'll take that somewhere else then. And it is great to see those men who have come on here, and it is worth noting that of the members of the Senate who come on, there have been mostly male, and I can see Altaf Hussein here, Jack Sargent was on the call, and there's probably people who I've missed. But you know, that message is getting out there. Our ambassadors from each party are male, and they, you know, they all play their part. And Ben Lake, I've just been told, just been messaged, is also on this call. So it's really, really good to know, you know, that men are stepping into this space. But I think what we need to do is give men confidence to step into the space where they see things that they're not comfortable with, where they see maybe their workmates behaving in a way that is inappropriate. Maybe in the classroom, they see their friends behaving in a way, but the peer pressure gets to them, so they don't speak at that moment, but they need a safe space to say that somewhere else. Because very often people stay quiet because they don't know how to speak out. And you know, when I talk to people, and I have done for many years on this, that's some of the feedback that I've had, you know, that they want to say something, but they don't feel empowered to do it. They certainly don't join in, they stay silent. And it's a bit like, you know, don't be a bystander. It's easy to say don't be a bystander if you feel empowered to say something, but if you don't feel empowered to say something, then I'm afraid people do become bystanders. So I'm throwing up a challenge, only from feedback that I've had, and I suppose it's training as many people as you possibly can, so that those people do feel empowered. And I've heard young men time and time again say to me, oh my goodness, the way he spoke to his mother, his girlfriend, his sister, I felt really uncomfortable, but I was in their house, or I was in their works canteen, or you know, whatever. So that, I think it is part of everything we do. And I think I know, I agree with you, Rachel, their silence is consent, and they know that. And that's the issue I'm getting to. They know it and they feel really bad about it. But if they say something in it, you know, they just don't know how to say it. And sometimes it's their own mates, they're telling me. And, you know, so it's that. So anyway, I'm going to, it's just food for all of us to think about. But not all people who stay silent want to stay silent, they want to be empowered. So I'm going now to wrap this up and thank everybody. And I'm going to move it over to Ariane. I'm 2 minutes beyond time, I think, now. The National Federation of Women's Institute Chair, because we are coming to the end of what I think has been a successful morning. It won't end here. I intend to do research every year into this field, so it won't end here. We've got policymakers here, we've got members of the Senate here who've all picked up various questions, and we'll move it forward. Thank you. So over to you, Ariane.
Diolch yn fawr. Yes, now we're coming to the end of the event, and I think we've had a very valuable meeting. It's not been good hearing about 80% of young girls scared of going out alone. It's a terrible thought, isn't it? And we've heard how parental domestic abuse has been a huge impact on the lives of these young people. We really must challenge all abuse that is going on. It's about learning to respect each other, and we must learn together to support these young people. I have been young people's in the community. I've been having a youth club for 30 years, so I've got some experience of local young people, but we must look after our young people. And it's not been easy over the pandemic to hear about all the increase of young people attending A&E with abuse-related assaults. So much more needs to be done. And I've just seen a message that FUW are also supporting us, and this relates to last year's campaign as well. Anyway, thank you very much to all of you, and we look forward to the next 5 years to work and carry on the good work and push the agenda to women in the street and at home to make Wales a safe place for women and girls to live. I would like to extend my huge thanks to our 4 speakers for their excellent, insightful contribution, to Jane Hutt, MS Minister for Social Justice, and to Kate from Girl Guiding UK, Vivian Lang from NSPCC Cymru, and Lara Snowden from Wales Violence Prevention Unit. Diolch yn fawr iawn i chi gyd. And also thank you, Joyce, for all the hard work you do. On the 22nd of November, we'll be hosting another online stakeholder event. And they are also planning a candlelight vigil on the steps of the Senate to show solidarity with the victims and the survivors of violence against women across the world. Please do join us at these events if you're able to. This year, those attending the vigil at the Senate will need to register in advance to attend due to the Senate protocols in response to the COVID-19. In the event of adverse weather conditions, we will move indoors to hear the speaker contribution. However, 64 is the maximum number of people that would be allowed to enter the Senate building, and the contact details of attendees for track and trace purposes would be required. A link to register for both events will be available shortly. And can I also thank the Wales office for all the hard work they do with this campaign, and also to thank you for hosting this event. Without you, we couldn't have done this. Diolch yn fawr. And it's over to you, Joyce, for your closing comments.
Well, thank you, Ariane, and thanks to Sarah, who always seems to get embarrassed when I mention how excellent she is. And if you wanted a really excellent PA and organizer, I don't think you'll go do any better, because she is amazing. And of course, all the team behind who do an excellent job. And I think it's worth saying now that all the work that's been done by the Women's Institute in Wales, it's now starting to be taken notice of and expanding to England. So we're exporting the really good practice here in Wales to England. And that was actually mentioned at last year's conference that we had. So I think, you know, that's the power, isn't it, of doing things in your community, that people pick them up and run with them. I thank you all for attending and your contributions, and I said they will be noted. But I think we do at this time, and we will on the 22nd, remember those people who've tragically lost their lives. You know, they are all individuals. They all have families, had families, and their pain goes on every single day. But at the same time, we have to support the survivors, and that's what we were hoping to do today. And in some cases, prevent those actions from happening in the first place. And somebody said that it is preventable. If we have enough information and enough data and enough people to pick up and support, these things are preventable in some cases. I would normally be able to say have a safe trip home, but I suppose most of you are sitting at home, and that's fantastic. But what I will say is I hope to see you all soon. And I want to commend also the FUW for their work in being advocates alongside others, because they're going to support ambassadors. And I think that that is important when we remember the rural setting, because most of Wales is rural and we have very large conurbations. But I think the messages, the speeches have been great. There are people here who live their lives trying to improve things for women and children. Rachel Williams is certainly one of those people. I follow her all the time. She's forever active. And, you know, does it in her own time. So that's why I've sort of singled her out from her own dreadful experience. She's a force to be reckoned with, but a good force for women. So I thank you all, and I'll see you all soon. Thank you.
Diolch yn fawr iawn.